Sands. Tonight we're going to be talking about some of the smaller armament and tanks that was in World War II and developed in between World War I and World War II. We'll be talking specifically about the M3 Stewart, the M5 Stewart, and some of the tanks that were battled against them. We're going to be talking about these little tanks, and I had no idea they played as an important part in the World War II as they did. They let's just kind of pull up an example here. This is the M5 Stewart, but we're going to talk a little bit about the M3 Stewart, which is over on the screen over here, if you can see that, okay. And that M3 Stewart was a development that they did shortly, about halfway between World War II and World War I, when they started building more tanks and trying to modernize the tanks. So, Adam, tell us some specifications and some of the things that led up to the development of the M3 Stewart.
Yeah, so the M3, as you said, it was a light tank. It was designed by the U.S. before the U.S.'s entrance into World War II. It would be sent to the British forces, about 170 of them would be sent to the British forces in Operation Crusader, and that would be in November of 1941.
Those would have been the M3s.
Yeah, those are the M3s.
And there's quite a bit of difference between an M3 and an M5, so we'll get into those specs too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so still talking about the M3, we have a 37 millimeter gun.
Which is the same one that went on to
the M5.
Yep.
We have 33,000 pounds, or about 15 metric tons, 15.2 metric tons.
So that's a heavy little tank for how
small it is.
Small it is, yeah, geez.
Crew of 4, and it had twin Cadillac Series V2 220 horsepower engines in it.
Yeah, that twin engines. Now, did I read right that it had a single crankshaft?
I believe that's true, yeah.
So they had two V8s, would have to be like Siamese together on a single crankshaft. How on earth did they do that?
I don't know. And in the M3, the British really complained about the crankshaft and the transmission going right through the crew compartment. It was obnoxiously placed, and so that was one of the complaints about the original Stewart, the M3.
Well, if they stick two V8 engines in the middle of a little tank like that, I would think that would be obnoxious. Come to think about it, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I would think so.
All right, now they build a whole bunch of these things. So the M4s, M3s, A1s, they started out with a diesel engine. What was the diesel engine?
I think they had a radial.
Oh, they started out with the same radial engine they put in the M4 Shermans. How many people, how many guys?
Crew of 4. Commander, gunner, driver, assistant driver. Okay.
You know what? They built a bunch of these. Guess how many they built of the M3s over here?
I'd guess probably less than 40,000, less than the Sherman. Probably more than most of the Germans. I'd say maybe 15,000.
13,859 of these ugly M3s.
13,000 of them.
895, almost 14,000 of those, and they fought in all theaters of the war. The Germans, had better tanks, but we had more of them. Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of German tanks, here's the 38T, which you can see they're very similar in size. We want to keep this on this side because it had a track blown up on this side. Mm-hmm. They're similar in size and similar in gun, and this was that Czechoslovakian 38T, and this is what a basis of all the small tanks that the Germans built. They built a bunch of those too.
Yeah, all those Martyrs and
the Martyrs, the Martyr 3s, and the Hetzers.
And the Hetzers, yep.
All those tanks. We didn't bring those with us to show us tonight, though. But so you can see why the Americans thought maybe it was a good idea to go ahead and build this size of tank when the Germans built the 38T. So they're pretty 1-to-1. And it wasn't until the Germans started building a little bit bigger tanks, getting into the Panzers, the Panzer threes and fours.
Even the Panzer III, it was still good competition. It was really the Panzer IV, and then the bigger, obviously the Panzer V or Panther tank would be too much for it. But
Okay, there's the Panzer III. And so when they started building the Panzer III,
it would have more armor than the Stuart, but would have the same gun. I think actually the Panzer had a 35 and the Stuart had a 37.
yeah, so they were similarly armored, except for and then the Panzers had a crew of 5, which doesn't make much difference, but they were a newer generation of tank, better suspensions, better engines, all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
And they were more heavily armored, and so they were on a toe-to-toe fight. That's an old Panzer III there. That's one like a Panzer B or something like that. But so we have the 38Ts. They morphed into the Panzer IIIs, and then they responded with the 38Ts with the
M5.
M5.
Yep.
Well, M3s, and then they morphed the M3s into the M5s, and the M5s were far superior over the M5s up here. Were a lot better than the M3s because they started learning their lessons. They started putting a sloped glacis on the front. They put a lot thicker armor on it. They had a better turret, and they put turbohydromatic transmissions in them.
Right.
And they were a quick little tank. And I think, how fast did they go?
They went over 36 miles an hour.
Yeah, 36 miles an hour. And so they would scoot all over the battlefield, And so really, until the Shermans started showing up in 42, this was the main tank that the U.S. were fighting in World War II when they started out over, when they started shipping them over to the Brits. And then when we first got in the war, they shipped a bunch of these over. 13,000 M3s, and over the course of the lifetime, they built over 9,000 of the M5s. And the M5s are just, they says, okay, the M3 starts out pretty good. What can we do to improve it? And so they would take lessons off the battlefield. The main thing they did was they take this almost vertical glacis out here, so a shell would hit that and just go right in it. And then they put the sloped armor here, and then here they had the windows here that were weak, and so they'd lose a lot of drivers and things that way. And then they put these are the hatches up there, and they had periscopes that would pop up.
So a lot safer for the crew.
A lot safer on the crew, and then they increased the reliability of the drivetrain. So by the time they were building mass quantities of M5s, they were actually a very solid running tank, and people loved them. They had some fun nicknames for them. Do you remember some of the nicknames?
Yeah, so the Stewart was originally a nickname. The Americans wouldn't call it a Stewart. We'd call it the M5.
Yeah.
But the British called it the Stewart after the Civil War general, Jeb Stuart. But they also called it Honeys. They called it Honeys because it was such a smooth ride.
Yeah, it had that toggled suspension, and yeah. So they called them the Honeys. But they really liked them. And, I'm still wondering how that twin V8s worked off of that single camshaft. And then they had a hydromatic transmission. They had a 6-speed forward automatic transmission, which, of course, after World War II, most of the cars were built with an automatic transmission after that.
Right.
And so,
but it was one of the first with automatic transmission.
Yeah. And so they were easy to drive. They were reliable. If they stayed out of a toe-to-toe with the bigger tanks. But this was the M5 was definitely the predecessor to why did they call it the M4?
Yeah, so I think they actually learned their lesson on the M3. For those of you who have watched our channel before, you'll remember that there's another tank called an M3, the M3 Lee or the M3 Grant. We've talked about it before. It was the predecessor to the M4 Sherman.
They're ugly buggers.
Yeah, they would precede the Sherman, and they came out at the same time that the M3 Stewart did. And that inevitably caused confusion because they didn't even call them Lees or Grants or Stewarts because those were the nicknames given to them by the Brits. They were just called M3s or M3 Lights and M3s. So when it came to the next generation of M3, they went to an M5 designation so they wouldn't be confused with the Sherman.
With the M4 Sherman. Ta-da! That's why they skipped the development cycle of the M3, because Chrysler Corporation was already in development of the M4s after they started seeing the Panzer III showing up. And that's when they got hustling and started to develop the M4s. Mm-hmm. And so they went from the M3s, skipped the M4s, but they called it M4 for a while.
Right.
But they were two different. The Cadillac Motor Division was building these. Chrysler's building the M4s, the Shermans. But like you said, the Americans didn't call the M4 the Shermans. The British called it the Sherman. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until after the American soldiers got over to Europe and they referred them to the Shermans, and that's what they were known.
Then we picked it up, yep.
Yeah. Because everybody knew what a Sherman was, but everybody go, oh, what the heck's an M4? So anyway, so that's kind of fun. It's kind of some lineage, just kind of glossing over stuff. But the Germans had the 38T, and they were quite prolific. So they went and had to answer the 38Ts with the M3, and then just like everything else develops, they found a lot of problems with the M3. Mm-hmm. They improved it till they came up with the current versions of the M5 Stewarts. And so these are both examples of the M5 Stewarts. This would be an African core, and this one here. But they used them everywhere.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was unique about this tank is that it would be the most used tank by the Allies in the Pacific Theater.
Oh, yeah. They didn't. The M4 Shermans never made it over to
They did, but they weren't used very much. Same with the M3 Grant. It would be shipped over there, but used only very little. But because of the smaller design of the tank, and because of the competition it was up against, the M3 Lee and M5 Lee M3 Stewart and M5 Stewart were perfect competition for the Japanese.
Yeah. Now, Japanese came up with a tank that almost looked like a carbon copy of...
It does.
Yeah.
Here we have a picture of that. This is the Type 95 Ha-Go, and it would be the main tank used by the Japanese in World War II, especially in the jungle regions. They fought against the British. They fought against the U.S. And in all cases, they were fighting against those darn Stewarts, and the Stewarts were doing well.
So that's what they were using over. I guess I could really put those on the troop transports and get a lot of them over there. And like I said, they were shipping most of the M4 Shermans to Europe,
right,
to fight against the larger, heavier German tanks.
Yep.
Yeah,
and that's really where the need was for those larger tanks, was in Europe, where you didn't have massive jungles that you were fighting in, or islands. So you had lots of amphibious, assaults.
You see this little rake thing on the front? This is actually a brush cutter for what they developed to use over in the islands, in the Pacific Theater. So this is a brush cutter, so they could actually just go through.
Just chop down the bushes in front of them.
Go through in the jungle, because it was very difficult. They didn't have that much of a trouble in Europe with those because, they go through forests, and these can navigate through forest fine, a lot of roads. But
right
in the Pacific Theater, they just would put these on these old vegetated islands, and the Japanese would be dug in, and this is actually a brush cutter. So this is more of the Pacific Theater, and this would have been more of the European theater. And so, but there's kind of the genealogy. Oh,
yep.
Something that developed directly from the M5. And this is when we start getting more in the modern tanks.
Yeah, and you can tell just from the design, it's got a lot more of a modern aesthetic.
These came out in what, 44. This is the M24 Chaffee. And it uses the same double V8 single crankshaft hydromatic transmission as the M5 Stewart did. These have the same drivetrain in them. And I thought that was funny. They had improved and refined the drivetrain enough that this had the dual Cadillac engines as this did. They used the same thing, and these tanks weighed the same.
Well,
Yeah,
that's a big
they were
size
both
difference
about,
to be the same.
well, this one was 18 tons, this one was 16 tons. There's only 4,000 pounds difference in those tanks, and that's nothing when it comes to tanks.
Yeah.
These are both considered light tanks, but the Chaffee was the people really liked the Chaffee tank. But it was a fast tank. It was it was over 35 miles an hour.
Yep.
As was the little ones.
Right.
But so even though it doesn't look like it, this is a direct descendant of these two tanks are linked almost
one right after the other.
one right after the other, using the same transmission and the same engine configuration. Right. Just a modern style, more, as you can tell, that looks a lot more like a Pershing.
It does. Definitely looks like a Pershing.
It looks like a mini Pershing, but it was a very popular tank. They built a bunch of the M24s too. And the M24s was one of the main tanks they used in the Korean conflict too.
Right, which makes sense because once again, you're dealing with jungles.
Yep.
Once again, you're dealing with islands.
I think they used it in Korea, I guess, in Vietnam or in the early 60s.
Yeah.
And so, but this was these morphed. So this really clunky thing morphed into this kind of clunky looking thing, which morphed into this pretty cool, modern looking tank.
Well, since we kind of discussed the development between the M3 and the M5, I wanted to highlight some of the differences. You talked about the similarities there with the drivetrain. One of the main differences is the suspension. The Americans went from that VVSS, vertical volute suspension system, to the torsion bar suspension system that the Germans have been using the whole time, and the Russians would use as well. So.
Yeah. That was developed by an American, by the way.
Was it?
Yeah.
That's funny. The Germans stole it from us, so we could steal it back.
Well, the Russians stole it from
us.
From us. We had built some tanks for them between World War I and World War II that had the torsion bar suspension. So when they did their
own tanks, their
T-34, T-34 series, they used the torsion bar, and all the tanks used the torsion bar. And after they quit building the these,
the Hetzer.
Then when they built the Germans, when they started seeing what was going on, they
went with the torsion bar as well.
I think they might have done their own development on it, but they got it from somewhere. But the first one to use it was the Americans on something else, and then the Russians were the first one to put it in tank production. But then by the end of the war, I think all of them were using torsion bar suspension. So that's another thing. This has, now look, the commonality here, you got the same sort of toggle suspension, just different. This is a newer version of this toggle suspension here. What did you call the
The VVSS.
The VVSS suspension. And what it stands for, I don't know.
It's vertical volute suspension system. And I don't know what vertical volute means, but that's what it says.
Yep. And then we go from there to the torsion bar system that is what's even used in modern tanks today. And then, of course, the Germans, did this use a torsion bar?
I don't know if...
I can't remember or not. And then, of course, the Panzer, that's a Panzer III, and all the Germans' tanks would use the torsion bar suspension.
So what's your favorite thing about the Stewart?
I think they're kind of funky looking.
Okay.
They're almost steampunk to me. They just look like the toy soldiers or something. No, I'm not trying to insult anybody who drove one, but they just look kind of funky, and that's in a good way. I think they're kind of small. I'm not sure if I wouldn't just drive one of these down as one of the bigger ones, just because they were more nimble, they were more reliable. They had almost the same armament on them, and if they had to get out of Dodge, they could do it. And
The Russians did receive them. It was part of the
They did,
Lend-Lease,
didn't they?
part of the Lend-Lease program.
Yeah.
But because of the Russian climate, there's lots of mud that accumulates during the summer, and then just frost during the winter, right?
Right.
And these thin tracks, you can tell that, like if you compare, even these are pretty thin.
Yeah, the Germans had problems with the Russian mud also.
With the Russian mud. But these are very thin tracks, and so they would sink in the mud.
They had that problem with the Shermans too.
Yep. So the Russians, when they got them, they're like, we can't use them. They just get stuck in the mud. And by then, they were already in development of the T-34s, and of course, a T-34 against a Stewart is child's play.
Yeah.
So the Russians didn't like them very much. We didn't even send. I think we only sent like 5 or so of the M5s because the Russians just didn't even want them.
Yeah. Well, who would want that when they have 34s in their back pocket?
Yep.
Yeah.
My favorite thing about the Stewart was that it really shined in the Pacific theater. Tank warfare wasn't a big thing in the Pacific theater.
We have never talked about the Pacific theater before.
There wasn't much reason to talk about it because tank conflict wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
There were tanks involved, but other than these small tanks, they were largely irrelevant. It was mostly a battleship and Air Force war.
And ground troops.
And ground troops, yeah. But this little light tank, this Stewart, because of its small size, was able to contribute a massive amount to the capabilities of the United States in the Pacific theater.
And I still want to see a twin V8 engine on a single crankshaft. I got to find a picture of that somewhere.
Yeah.
We'll have to do that in a further talk.
Good follow up. Yeah. Find a tank museum and go see what its crankshaft looks like.
Or just a picture of one would work for me right now. So. All right.
Well, I think that's it.
All right. Well, without further ado, subscribe, damn it. Bye.